Our next speaker, Mantle is Professor of Ethnomusicology, Chair of the Graduate Institute of Musicology, and Director of the Asia Pacific Music Research Center at the Tainan National University of the Arts, Taiwan. He serves as Chair of the ICTM Performing Arts Southeast Asia Study Group. His previous posts were at University Putra, Malaysia, Melbourne University, and Monash University in Australia. His current research interests include ontologies of sounded movement, endangered forms of vocalization, tuning systems, as well as music and social justice. He is currently the lead researcher in the Taiwan Ministry of Science and Technology funded project towards the sustainability of vocal heritage in the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. He is the author of Triguna, a Hindu-Balinese philosophy for gamelan gongge the music, and co-editor of Music, Ethics, and the Community. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Made Mantle.
The title of my paper this afternoon is Performing Ontologies to Shape Asia-Pacific Periphery Identities. And for decades, musical identity has been an important theoretical framework for exploring and explaining the construction of individual, group, and institutional and national identity. Pioneering studies broke entrenched boundaries based on rigid ethnic and national labels to consider the complexity of musical identities entangled in multi-generational immigrant and diasporic communities. There's also been studies that have made correlations between music industry and teenage identity groups dictating consumer consumption. However, these studies were often coupled with a worldview that privileged global North sense-making of the global South. For this reason, decolonizing discourses have much to offer in a reexamination of musical identity. The recent ontological turn taken in anthropology sees the decentering of power hierarchies as a crucial to the centering of marginalized worldviews. So in this paper, I'd like to examine how Asia-Pacific displays of musical identity may be deconstructed as performing ontologies when local worldviews are prioritized. Now, to do this, I present case studies on sound and movement and ritual vocalizations amongst Hindu-Balinese performing artists. Through reembracing the once marginalized classical vocal genre called kakawin, singers have broadened platforms for identity and inclusivity through mixed-gender vocal competitions, art festivals, and youth groups. Balinese dancers and musicians also negotiate each other's art forms in an attempt to maintain pre-modern ontologies that see sound and movement as inextricably linked rather than as separate or bounded categories. So in this paper today, I argue that marginalized worldviews in musical identity may be performed and displayed as locally constructed ontologies in the Asia-Pacific. And these worldviews are ontologies based on traditions that predate the nation. Regionally, for example, before the indigenous Ifugao in the northern Philippines were subsumed under the Philippine flag, Hudhud storytellers narrated ontologies about agriculture and funerary rites. Long before the archipelago was united as Indonesia, Javanese and Balinese singers voiced the views of sages, lords, and priests from the Mahabharata and Ramayana in Indonesia. However, today, epic singing constructs much more than tradition-based ontologies. It includes worldviews that simultaneously negotiate popular culture and even assimilate musical styles and influences to shape identities from Southeast Asia's rapidly modernizing soundscapes. So in my paper today, I use the term performing ontologies to describe the expression or presentation of worldviews that negotiate between inherited traditions and modern cultural practices. To illustrate this, I focus on kakawin, the Balinese practice of singing and interpreting Old Javanese poetry, and how artists have adapted during the pandemic. Because poems are written in an archaic language, the practice of sounding the text and translating it into the vernacular is central to its transmission, whether it's during face-to-face temple ceremony or an online workshop. So suffice to say, if no one sings these epics, they would likely die out. For generations, epic singing has made temporal bridges to Arjuna Wiwaha's 10th century Hindu asceticism and the Buddhist teachings of the priest Sutasoma. It's brought these out into the open. It's brought them out onto online Facebook groups, YouTube, and other social media platforms. And of course, this is not without its challenges in identity formation. The popular practice of kakawin also promotes superficial understandings of complex literary texts. So in the first part of my paper today, I'd like to further elaborate on my concept of performing ontologies by delving into the growing body of literature based on the ontological turn. Then I'll survey the performance of kakawin and other related genres to see how the once elite practice of epic singing has been decentralized as an adaptive strategy during the COVID-19 pandemic through the inclusive genres of mixed gender vocal competitions, arts festivals, and youth groups. I move away from concepts and bounded categories like music, dance, ritual singing. I move towards the view that sounded texts are performed ontologies that negotiate traditions via social media platforms and modern cultural practices. My use of the term performing ontologies for epic singing in Bali, Indonesia, is inspired by the decolonization of theorization and anthropology's ontological turn. Moving away from the top-down application of Western European theories, the ontological turn seeks to more radically prioritize fieldwork and theorize through acknowledging multiple ways of being in the world. Differing worldviews are not simply distinctive depictions of the same world, but are, quote, differences in worlds, end quote. Beyond Heidegger's Dasein, ontological anthropologists argue that the usual task of acknowledging and describing the reality of cultural difference implies the false notion that there is some unitary world, reality, or nature to begin with. Ontological anthropology disputes such a notion, instead asserting that, quote, worlds as well as worldviews may vary. Different worlds, unitary reality? What exactly is ontology? Ontology is the branch of philosophy that studies concepts such as existence, being, becoming, and of course reality. Ontology is the study of what is in the mind, for example, the world around you, and the study of reality through perception. For example, I'm speaking to you now in this Asia-Pacific Society of Ethnomusicology conference at UP. You're watching me give a paper, or are you? Am I reading a paper? Or are you simply processing megabytes of sound and light streaming through your computer screen that you interpret as your reality of Made Mantle Hood giving a paper? Back to reality and the ontological turn. I'll give you a few examples of prioritizing ontologies in research. A project in Brazilian universities called the Meeting of Knowledges has expanded the very definition of knowledge, where Brazilian rainforest indigenous elders are treated as equals alongside university professors. Michael Brunbauer Quintero shows how Colombian Pacific music moves away from bounded categories such as music, dance, and ritual as givens, and replaces them with ontologies about, quote, sound as an interaction between humans, spirits, and other non-human agents, end quote. The ontology of performance for Arnhem Land Indigenous Australians sees snakes, birds, and other animals as, quote, active participants in the creation and composition of performance, end quote. Not only performers, but audiences require us to rethink who or what is being performed. For example, a people-centered ontology of audience as receivers of performance does not take into account spirit ancestors, divine beings, and other intangible third parties for whom sound and movement is intended. Does John Blacking's humanly organized sound still have validity when Habu dancers of Melanesia, who act as spiritual mediators, say, "We as humans are ghosts"? Habu dancers remind us that categorical divisions between humans and nature are problematic, as these may not be separate entities or discrete bodies. This leaves the question of who or what is organizing sound and movement to be answered by members of the relevant cultural group. So I turn now to some examples of ontologies about epic singing in Bali. Balinese literary genres come to life through sounding text. Poetry, written centuries ago, becomes meaningful for today's generation of Balinese through oral performance. As Wallace, Schumacher, and Herbst have noted, there are at least 3 different contexts for epic singing. One is poetry associations, called Sako Mabalsan. The second would be the 5 types of ritual ceremonies, called Panchayajna. And the third is performing arts, dance dramas, shadow plays, and festivals. In each of these contexts, literary ontologies from the past can merge with modern interpretations of identity. For example, epic singing of kakawin in poetic associations requires the jurobaos, who's the chanter or reciter, as well as the jurobaso, an expert interpreter. It requires both of these performers to sit in front of their wooden tray, holding a written text or a manuscript. Chanters sing out loud from the manuscript, and after the recitation of a phrase in a stanza, a break or a pause in recitation occurs. This is called palat baso. In this example, the interpreter inserts a spoken Balinese translation of the old Javanese text. This translation may be considered a bridging of ontologies, because the wider audience has no comprehension of old Javanese language. In this way, past ontologies in archaic prose confuse with modern worldviews through interpretation. Past and present ontologies are also fused in a related style of epic singing called kidung, sung in small mixed gender groups. But kidung can also help construct what Philip Bowman calls my and your ontology. For example, in 2009, my 6-month-old daughter Mahealani had her purification ritual at our home temple. In the video clip that follows, my mother-in-law, Nino Manchandri, who's one of Bali's most celebrated classical vocalists, sings while holding my daughter. My brother-in-law, Komang Sudirga, sings with her. So in this Kidung video, ritual and religion help construct the ontology of epic singing as a bridge to sacred teachings, Hindu philosophy, and intellectual wisdom. But it also influences my own ontology. In his introduction to the edited volume, Rethinking Music, Bolman says, quote, "The ontology of my music is personal, deriving from conditions that have individual meanings and are unlike the conditions for your music," end quote. I take comfort in knowing my children have a loving Hindu-Balinese family. In this way, I construct my own personal ontology about epic singing as a comforting sound that often cradles my worried mind as a father. But not all constructions of epic singing ontologies are deeply personal or necessarily religious. I turn now to examples from commercial and entertainment sectors that often appropriate and essentialize epic singing to form identity. For this research paper, I contacted Ni Made Ayu Oka Wijayanti, who studied with Desa Suarti Laxmi, who studied with my mother-in-law Ibu Chandri. It's a small world. Ayu is a graduate student of Balinese literary studies at Udayana University. In my interview, Ayu explains the dilemma facing young singers who struggle with proper vocal technique. Aside from formal competitions, popular singers tend to ignore the rules about proper vocal quality and simply sing what is pleasing to the ear.
Di pengalaman saya, kalau untuk lomba, guru itu pasti mengajarkan sumber suara kekawin itu di mana. Kalau di Bali kita punya kekawin sekar agung, sekar madya, dan sekar alit, jadi itu mempunyai sumber suara yang berbeda. Jadi kalau sekar agung itu di kerongkongan dalam suaranya, kemudian untuk sekar madya di tengah lidah, dan sekar alit nenggel hampir ke ujung gigi, di ujung lidah, ya tinggi. Jadi kalau untuk takaran lomba, kiranya pasti anak didik itu disuruh di mana sumber suara yang baik, yang benar. Kalau untuk budaya pop, sekarang banyak sekali videografer membuat video seperti trailer, tracer begitu, dengan latar belakang kekawin kah atau kidung gitu. Dan sudah mengabaikan kaidah-kaidah sumber suara seperti itu, hanya asal enak didengar saja.
Ayu's assessment indicates that changing aesthetics and vocal quality are part of the negotiation between generational preference. At first glance, it appears to be the age-old issue of continuity and change. But at a deeper level, replacing epic singing's aesthetics with Western European vibrato and diastonicism that's pleasing to the ear decenters the very identity of the voice, the speaker, the culture bearer, and the ontology being performed. Performing ontologies in epic singing is a contestation of worlds where meanings shape individual and group identity, and the voice is a principal determinant of these worlds. My last example of epic singing comes from sung prayers or mantra. About 2 months ago, a self-reflective theatrical production about tourism dependency and the COVID-19 pandemic called Taksu Ubud took place in Ubud village, where residents have been hit hard by the pandemic. As a theater production, Taksu Ubud was intended to revive the spirit of suffering artists. Starring national Indonesian actress and model Happy Salma and Balinese composer Iwayan Sudirana, it featured a dramatic scene of introspection and epic singing I'd like to share with you now. The scene is devoted to Dewi Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge. Her divinity is depicted in painting, dance, a bowed lute called rabab, and a mantra prayer in Saraswati's honor. The sung text speaks of Saraswati as the giver of blessings and the fulfiller of wishes, a nurturing artistic portrayal during the harsh reality of a worsening pandemic.
Saraswati Namastubhyam
In my discussion with the composer Sudirana, he said that, quote, "We intended to create this scene with the hope that we can get blessings from the God of knowledge. In the scene, the painting is Saraswati, the dancer is Saraswati, and the vocalist are all Saraswati. Hopefully the audience are also given blessings from Saraswati through chanting the actual Saraswati mantra," end quote. He went on to say the religious connotations of the singing were a beautifully wrapped message so that the audience can have their own interpretations. The view that chanting a mantra can nourish the soul during a pandemic is to call upon the ontological view that blessings and wishes are often granted when we look inside ourselves. Deriving strength to persevere in the times of hardship can come from epic singing. Sounding inherited literary texts can help mend broken spirits in times of crisis. In this way, a modern production like Taksu Ubud, endorsed by a national television star, helps bridge worldviews from pre-modern times. In conclusion, performing ontologies in epic singing involves several intersecting and overlapping reference points. As it affects Balinese identity with each performance, it can gesture towards the ontology of nature, divinity, and spirit. When singers chant mantras on the national stage, streamed live on YouTube, identity can expand to encompass the nation and social formations such as cosmopolitans, diaspora, and migrants. But expressing identity through epic literature also becomes what Philip Bowman calls our music versus their music, because the sung epic, quote, exhibits a powerful capacity to contribute to social and communal cohesiveness, end quote. In many ways, sung epics as identity markers help distinguish through the voice one community from another. Finally, performing ontologies can also involve the very personal and intimate construction of worldviews at the juncture where my music and your music formulates meanings. For me, Kidung epic singing brings up the comforting and reassuring image of my baby girl being serenaded by her grandmother during her purification ceremony. Sudirana's Taksu Ubud reminds listeners our Buana Alit, or our internal world, may be calmed by the blessings of the divine Saraswati during a pandemic crisis. Today's popularity of epic singing among youth in a post-COVID Indonesia consistently decentralizes what was identified as an elite vocal practice. This allows inheriting generations to broadcast their interpretations of sung epics to a much larger audience and form identities rooted in tradition-based ontologies of performance. Thank you.